It had been quite some time since Kevin took the shortcut through the dark wood at the end of the road. When he was much younger, and running late for supper, he would pedal his way home on the wheels of his trusty 10-speed and emerge just feet from Old Man McGinty's property line at the end of his street. For some reason, a gap no more than a shoulder-length wide had been left between the two otherwise enormous stretches of wrought iron fence-work which marked the boundary of the wood on its southern end. More than once, Kevin tried to climb the rusty bars behind the backyard of his house, but it was no use. The massive growth of tangled ivy, of the not good kind, had intermingled with thorny vines and thistles for seemingly the entire length of the fence, and made climbing it an extremely unpleasant experience at best. The bars were often slippery too, though he couldn't for his life determine why. Nonetheless, or maybe because of this factor, he recalled several falls in early childhood, which preceded motherly coddling, and several instances of tears and sniffles. In Kevin's imagination, the overgrowth seemed somehow consciously opportunistic, as if it claimed the fence as its ladder to the life-giving light of the sun, struggling to be free of the wood in hopes of colonizing some new ground. Or maybe it just hoped to get as far away as possible from its source, just like Kevin did after college. But that was years ago, and now the house was his and his alone, and well, sometimes he still found himself running late. His edifice of gainful employment lay just past the north egress of the wood in a broken-down strip mall off the main drag. The town had, in general, seen better days, and commercial growth of the nationwide sort had replaced the old mom-and-pop shops that previously gave the town its unique character. Nonetheless, it was hard to believe that such little development had taken root, no pun intended, around the dark wood. It was just one time, Kevin rationalized aloud, regarding the suspension of his driver's license. It was probably for the best, he added. After all, who needs more bills? For goodness sake, with gas, insurance, and leasing, what do they think, I'm made out of money? He rhetorically posited under his breath. The passage through the dark wood afforded him an almost door-to-door trot just around dusk every weekday. So it seemed that today was to be another shortcut day. Maybe I should get a bike, he thought to himself, reticent to spend more time in the wood than he had to. He daren't even tell his friends. They'd think he was as much of a daredevil as he was in the old days, and as stated, everyone knew to avoid the dark wood. Urban, or rather suburban legend, had posited a number of unverifiable premises as to why nearly everyone routinely avoided trekking through the wood. It had alternatively been depicted as the site of a now demolished mental asylum with a tragic history, a place where a brutal serial killer disposed of the bodies of his numerous unwilling victims, a horribly desecrated Native American cemetery, and lastly, the sacred place where a coven of dark witches and warlocks conjured their wicked and malevolent spells against the unwitting, peaceable townfolk. These tales were individually each about a century old, and, of course, none of them could be substantiated in the least. Nevertheless, the perception that some sort of a presence lingered in the wood held sway in the public's imagination. One time, Kevin and his friend John were on their way back to Kevin's house after a long summer day of wilderness exploring and other minor teenage hijinks, and found themselves standing before the imposing tree line of the wood, confronted with the very same time-to-destination quandary. John often came over for dinner and to hang out in Kevin's basement, and afterward, his parents would pick him up in their beast of a family car. In retrospect, it was usually pretty late for a school night. I guess the old folks were all cooler than they let on. But, regardless, Kevin remembered the pair poised to bike along the almost imperceptibly trodden path that cut through the unusually thick layer of rotted matter that defined the strangely fragrant swath of abbreviated forest. "Come on," cajoled Kevin, his stalwartness perhaps emboldened by John's presence. But John would have none of it. "Maybe we should go around," he protested. "Nah, let's go. Dinner's in like 10 minutes, and you know how my mom gets. Besides, if we eat fast, we'll have more time to game after," Kevin bargained. It was the first and the last time John drove through the wood with Kevin, and by the time they got to Old Man McGinty's fence hole, John was pretty much in tears, hyperventilating and scared half out of his wits. Nothing happened to either, of course, but that was just the catch. No one in their right mind wanted to see if something would happen, and so most folks gave the wood a wide berth, except, that is, for Kevin. And so, the late shift it was, and time was short, and Kevin stood at the opening in the wrought iron fence. Tentatively, he placed one foot, and then the other, over the boundary line and into the sopping matting of damp leaves that characterized the firmament underfoot throughout the dark wood. Unlike most parcels of forested growth, where leaves and twigs crunch and fracture beneath one's feet, breaking into smaller and smaller slivers of decaying matter, the patina of rot that obscured the earth in the dark wood seemed to know no season, and remained for the most part spongy and slippery no matter how hot or dry or how frosted the climate was. As Kevin moved slowly into the embracing folds of spindly outgrowths and petrified branches, he noted how his boots sunk ever so gently into the mushy layer of matter, leaving him with the distinct impression that if he desired to hold in one place, he might very well sink into the muck, as if it were quicksand, without the sand or the quick. The trail that winded through the wood was sparsely marked, and as it curved deeper into the terrain, it became more difficult to discern due to the incrementally increasing darkness that the pervasive canopy contributed to the overall and untimely gloom of the place. Kevin reckoned that outside the wood it could not have been so dusky. For heaven's sake, it was clear as a bell out, and there was barely a cloud moving across the azure-tinted sky. All the more reason to move the process along, mused Kevin to himself, as he increased his speed accordingly. As his tempo gradually sped from a brisk walk to a light trot, if not a run, he noted that his heightened velocity directly paralleled his agitated emotional state. This was not surprising in many respects, because the more Kevin scanned ahead in an attempt to discern the end of the wood, his failure to do so made that elusive goal seem all the more out of reach and abstract. Did it really take this long to cross the wood when I was a kid? He asked himself, now anxious, glancing hastily at his wristwatch. Of course, this would have been quite an interesting query to have answered in light of the circumstances, but, unfortunately, Kevin's timepiece had ceased to function, and so no comparison could be effectively measured. Did it stop just now, or did I forget to install that new battery I bought the other day when I saw it beginning to slow down? He wondered to himself. But, regardless of the state of the watch, often memory and reality can be conflated by the passage of time, and Kevin's memories of the dark wood were anything but clear in his head. What Kevin did distinctly recall was that more than once his parents had called the police to look for him when he had been lost. While it only seemed a short while to him, on at least 5 occasions when the police finally found him, they determined that he had been gone for at least 4 to 6 hours each time. His parents, and we can assume the authorities, must have wondered what sort of mischief Kevin was up to in the wood. Perhaps he had built a secret fort, or a treehouse, or dug up a hidden stash of candy or magazines. But for the life of him, Kevin couldn't remember what he did in the wood for all those hours. He was probably just off in a world of his own, Wayne Daniels, a vaguely alcoholic local police officer, commented upon the 3rd occasion he rescued Kevin from his lost days in the wood. As he stood under the flickering porch light, his hand on Kevin's shoulder, this was cold comfort to Kevin's parents, who were beside themselves and half scared out of their wits by the time night was full on. Regardless of Officer Daniels' defense, it didn't stop younger Kevin from being absolved from the penance of being grounded and having a few new chores added to his already booming service roster. Dwelling on such fuzzy thoughts and half-forgotten memories so thoroughly distracted Kevin that shortly, as when he was younger, he began to completely lose track of time. He ambled all but unaware, and when his awareness came rushing back home like an eager and hungry pet, he looked down and noticed that he had wandered into a briar of tangled vines. He tugged his leg again and again, but as tangles often do when ensnaring an unwitting victim such as he, Kevin was summarily sent down to earth with the assistance of our old friend gravity. With a plodding thud, Kevin softly met the patina of sweetly pungent foliage, which seemed to buffer him from an even more severe impact to the shoulder. He half expected to see himself surrounded by a mass of those innumerably legged, slithering, primordial crawling things in the millie or centipede family, but to his surprise, the patch of ground he lay upon was as lifeless as windswept sand. In fact, not a rustling due to mammal life, nor even the sound of birds in the canopy was evident. The air was still and immobile, and the din of silence was almost deafening. His heartbeat drummed in his ears louder than ever before, and his groans of discomfort and the sound of his own form amid the leaves was all that he could perceive at any distance. He lay on that spot for quite some time, rather enjoying the absolute stillness. But after a while, Kevin rose, brushed himself off, and contrived that he would stay on course, speed his pace, and be more cognizant of his surroundings. He almost laughed aloud when he thought to himself, "Yeah, we'll see how long that lasts." But at the same moment he thought those words, a cold shiver went up his spine. Kevin glanced around, and then around again. "Is someone watching me?" he thought to himself, though it was less a thought than an impending sense of claustrophobia. An oddity, since Kevin had plenty of space all around him. As he glanced about, he swore that he glimpsed dozens of faces staring at him, as if they were warning him to take another path. But upon further consideration, Kevin knew that these were merely natural shapes mimicking human visages in his mind. Still, it didn't make him feel any less surrounded. "Is anybody there?" he said out loud, to only a stolid sequitur of stark silence. With no answer forthcoming, Kevin once again moved through the strangely familiar environment. It was as if he had trodden the same scrubby path 1,000 times, but he convinced himself that such a sensibility probably only occurred to him due to the fact that the inroads within the wood were so similar in appearance to one another. As he walked on, an unusual shape caught his eye to his left-hand side. Could it be? Yes, it was definitely familiar. And the more Kevin looked at the rickety remains of what appeared to be a once proud and ambitious project, he realized just what it was. It was as if a floodgate opened, and he remembered it clear as anything. It was the fort he built one time in his lost hours. He recalled sitting in it with his miniature toy soldiers and tanks, plotting strategies and imaginary battles. He glanced at the makeshift construction for quite some time, and a wave of sadness, of the forlorn, bittersweet sort, came over him. But then, nearby the fort, in fact, just feet away, he saw a hole, or maybe the hole would be a better way of describing it, because this hole was unlike any other dark, winding crevice that he had seen before or since. It was such an overwhelming moment that upon seeing it, Kevin's spirit was beset with a sense of comfort that almost bordered on, well, intimacy. Now, as specified, this wasn't just any hole. It wasn't an entrance to a wild animal's den or anything like that. It was, for lack of a better description, not natural. And Kevin knew that deep down in his bones. He recalled that the younger version of himself liked to imagine that the hole went to the center of the earth, like in that old movie. Or maybe the other end opened in China. Who knew? Perhaps it was infinite, like Mr. Craigson, his 6th grade math teacher, had once explained numbers were. Kevin recalled that once he tried dipping his foot into the hole. Needless to say, that didn't work out so well. It was as if his shoe became caught on something inside the hole, and he tugged and tugged for what seemed like hours. Eventually, Kevin was able to remove his appendage, but not without the casualty of one of his kids. It was probably the worst grounding he ever got, but Kevin could barely blame his folks for being as livid as they were. I mean, coming home in Officer Daniel's company, and half barefoot to boot, it was just weird. Why couldn't I just play like the other kids? Kevin rhetorically queried himself aloud. But staring at the hole, he knew very well why. That misshapen cavity in the dirt held all of the secrets in the world. It was far too mysterious not to, and Kevin could just feel it. Kevin's history teacher, Mrs. Jacobson, also in the 6th grade, had taught a whole unit on Greek mythology, and he remembered almost all of the amazing creatures that she described to the class. The siren seemed the most appropriate comparison to how Kevin felt about the hole. He felt compelled to visit it, to glance into the opening, to listen to the song that it sang, which only he could hear. In fact, most times he would just kneel before it, as if something would suddenly happen if he just waited long and patiently enough. At that moment, sitting before that odd little hole repeating his past, he remembered in retrospect his boldest moment, perhaps the most stalwart in his life, the day he laid on his side and reached his arm as far as he could into the hole. Kevin's outstretched arm clawed into the dark depths of that narrow chasm. Mud got on his face and his shirt, but he couldn't have cared less. His fervor was desperate, and he clawed deeper and deeper into the hole, as if he might reach out and touch something hidden in the earth. Many cultures in olden times had said giants or other strange creatures inhabited secret places deep in the ground. Maybe this was one of those forgotten entrances to their world that Kevin had found. Imagine that, to be the first boy to locate a world of some other species. Scientists would study them, and Kevin would go down in history. Maybe they would even name the creatures after him. Then his parents might see that he could amount to something. And so, he reached as deep as he could, and not just when he was a kid. Kevin realized that he was doing it even now, in the present. He didn't remember getting down on his knees, but here he was, prone, shoulder deep into the pit, sweating and grunting, trying to reach deeper and deeper, as if he was rending a rip to the bottom of his own soul. This went on for some time, and Kevin realized how this might seem. He feared that someone else might stumble upon him in this ridiculous endeavor. The sense of shame, in turn, made him take account of himself. He tried to pull his arm out of the hole, but, like his sneaker when he was 11, his arm just wouldn't withdraw from that damned hole. The term panic originally referred to a sacrificial offering given up to the lesser god Pan, the god of animal nature and unbridled sexuality. Pan was routinely depicted in ancient statuary as part man, part goat. But at this moment, such playful imagery was completely lost on poor Kevin, and his heart raced so fast that he thought his chest might burst open. And then he felt it. It was something intangible, but at the same time incredibly painful, like a dentist's drill or a sudden burn. Of course, we could all pity Kevin's pain, but this intangible agony was, in fact, not in the present at all, but rather in the past. And as Kevin recalled each moment more clearly, a memory of searing, almost endless agony that seized his arm when he first dug down into the pit became more opaque. He remembered that he felt the sting of what must have been a snake bite, or at least what he imagined a snake bite felt like, and a warm flush moved through his body via his veins. The tingling rush inched slowly up his arm and then into his neck until it reached his brain. Kevin was certain that he passed out at that point, but he also recalled a much more curious notion as well, one that he at first thought was déjà vu, but it wasn't. It was all too real. Kevin remembered that he had done this many, many times and come back for more. He knew that he had reached into the recesses of the dark hole at the center of the dark wood and felt that burning sting dozens, hundreds, maybe thousands of times. He knew that he passed out each time, but as hard as he concentrated, he couldn't for the life of him remember what happened next. But this time was different. And as he reached down in the present, he felt no physical pain. Instead, he heard the siren song of the pit in his head, and the words were the same as they had always been. The voice from the pit echoed in his head. It was a voice that was so sweet, mellifluous, and almost feminine, that its allure was siren-like. How could he resist? She, if you could ascribe gender to a voice inside of one's own head, called to Kevin in such gentle terms, so sensitive to the needs hidden deep in his psyche. He knew that he had no other choice than to comply. She was inside of him. For as much as he was wooed by her hypnotic song, he knew deep down that she could also be ferocious and unforgiving as well. She was his, and he was hers, and as long as he did as she asked, all would be well. The only problem was that what she asked for was a list that over time knew no short supply. Kevin's parents were clearly the first problem. They kept him away from the dark wood with their stupid chores and even stupider schoolwork. Officer Daniels, too, he was another fly in the ointment, always searching the wood and dragging Kevin back to his folks. That would just have to stop, too. At first, it seemed a simple task, but every once in a while he expected other children would decide that they too could violate the sanctity of the wood and mess around with his fort, or worse, come just too damn close to the secret entrance hole. And so, he would stand guard. He would stay in the dark wood whenever he could from then on. He would patrol the scrubby paths, the thick briars, and all along the rusty fence like a dutiful soldier, commissioned to make sure that everyone but he stay the hell out. Of course, he would have to go home occasionally. He would need to change his clothes and wash up once in a while. He had his day job, too. He had to go there. Or did he? Kevin would have to think about it, figure out some things about how he would manage this new lifestyle choice. Admittedly, it was odd, since every time he did go back to his old, empty, parentless house, he heard weird voices there. They were disembodied, like the voice from the hole, but they were different. Nowhere near as beautiful or otherworldly. It was as if some other family was hidden in the next room, like Goldilocks, always there but just out of reach. He heard the clink of glasses and silverware, furniture scraping the floorboards, and television shows that sounded like they were filtering through a thin hotel room wall. Kevin thought the dog barking was bad, but surely the worst part was the children. Why did they have to have such high-pitched voices? It was enough to drive him crazy. Oh well. At least he could get away from the sounds and voices and return to the dark wood, even if it was only for a trudge on his way to his job. And so, from then on, as now, he would go through the dark wood over and over, stuck in the rut of day-to-day employment, like we all do. But, as specified, that was all years ago. and Kevin had been traipsing through the dark wood for as long as he could remember. Still, it always felt new. Until, that is, this day. The day he crossed Officer Daniel's path in the dark wood. Was he looking for him, as he did back in the day? But this time would be different. Kevin was all grown up, and he imagined that he could easily outsmart the aging policeman. With his well-earned knowledge of the wood, Kevin could watch Officer Daniels from afar, and that he did. Kevin lingered around him, hiding behind trees and shrubs low to the ground. He felt like a Cold War spy, almost comically darting behind camouflage. Once or twice, when he moved after him too cavalierly, Kevin accidentally stepped on a mass of dry twigs. He was sure the snapping and popping would draw Officer Daniels' attention, but it didn't. Maybe the old man's hearing was ebbing out due to years on the firing range. Who knows? It didn't really matter, as long as he didn't find Kevin or the secret hole. As Officer Daniels moved away, it seemed as if he had avoided detection, and Kevin felt a congratulatory rush wash over him until he noted the arrival of another police officer, a younger one, who came from the other direction. They appeared to be looking for something, and so Kevin moved closer and listened more attentively. They were somehow hard to hear, like the weird voices from next door, but he did make out that they were searching for a young girl. The dark wood always seemed to be a go-to point whenever someone was lost, and so Officer Daniels and Officer Robertson were methodically mapping out the wood. They were pretty chatty for law enforcement personnel, and so Kevin thought it best to continue to observe them and find out about the missing girl. "Yeah, I used to come in here all the time back in the day. Kids would end up in the wood for hours," Officer Daniels explained. "Most of the time it was nothing but good old horseplay. Except for what?" Officer Robertson prodded. "It was one of the weird ones, maybe the weirdest of my entire stint. There was this one kid. At first it was just a nuisance, like the FD having to pluck a scared cat out of a tree. But each time I found him, he was a little more odd." "Odd like how?" Robertson queried. "Odd like his parents needed to send him away for help odd. But the institution they put him in didn't prove so able in curing him or being able to keep him there. He escaped. It was a 6-county-wide manhunt there for a while, and a lot of scuttlebutt had it that he was hiding out here in the dark wood." Kevin was aghast. Maybe his parents' terror in response to his lingering in the dark wood made absolute sense in retrospect. I mean, anything could have happened with a madman on the loose, even if the wood was just past his backyard. "He always seemed like a good kid to me. A little misunderstood, but within reason, he was all right. I just wish I could have seen it at the time. A lot of families could have been spared the heartbreak." "Sounds horrible. What did he do?" "I'd rather not talk about it. Let's just say there's a good reason why everyone avoids the dark wood." "But he was apprehended, right?" "Oh, we found his body, not far from here, if I recall. Something not normal had gotten to him. But that's not even the weird part. The disappearances kept happening, and we kept finding bodies. His parents, the family that moved in after his folks passed on, and pretty much anybody who went missing in town turned up in here, in the dark wood. Things had kind of settled down for a few years until this business with little Jackie Pearson. Her family only moved into the old McGinty house a few months ago." As the two officers moved on, searching the scrub in another part of the wood, Kevin thought to himself, what a horrible case. Now he finally knew why everyone avoided the dark wood. He guessed he was just lucky to have never encountered that crazy man in the wood when he was smaller. "Wayne, over here, I think I found something," Officer Robertson called out to Officer Daniels. Oh, geez, what a mess. I'd better call this in and get forensics out here pronto. The chief ought to know that he'll need to inform the Pearson family. That's always the worst part, Officer Daniels wearily muttered. Kevin crooked his neck, trying to get a clean look at what Daniels and Robertson had found, but he was too afraid to reveal his presence, and so he continued lurking behind a wilted juniper bush, all but hypnotized by the scene. It was like watching one of those primetime crime scene investigation series episodes right in front of him, without the commercial breaks. But then, out of nowhere, a voice called out to him from behind. Kevin's heart raced, and he drew in a breath in shock, jumped almost to a full stand, and turned about to see who had addressed him. Oddly, the officers failed to notice his sudden movements, even though they were only a few yards away. Then again, they also didn't notice the little girl who now stood before him. Oh, good. I didn't think you could hear me. I said, "Hi, my name is Jackie. Would you like to play? Nobody ever wants to play with me anymore. It's like I'm invisible," the young girl said. Kevin stared at the girl impassively, and then turned to Officer Daniels and Robertson as they laid a cloth of some kind over whatever they had found. I think I'd like that. I've been coming here a very long time. It would be nice to have some company for a change," Kevin explained. "There's so much we can do, as long as we don't allow anyone else to find the hole. That would be very, very bad," she stated. "Yes, that would be very bad. My name is Kevin, by the way. Hey, would you like to see my fort?" he inquired. "Oh, you made a fort? Oh, please, could I?" she implored. "It's right this way," Kevin announced gleefully. All in all, with all the odd feelings that one could or did experience when passing through the dark wood, Kevin had to admit that, for the first time in a long while, he was truly happy. And I have to admit, it was a very happy day when I met Kevin. Still, everyone knew to avoid the dark wood.